New World. Why do we begin the class with the year 1500? Several important things happened to the world around the year 1500. For one thing, it was about that time that Europeans began to discover ways to get to the world, the rest of the world. Up until that time, Europe had been largely isolated. Well, it wasn't just Europe. If you study world history, the history of mankind up to the year 1500 is like a mosaic. You have this group living in the Americas, unaware of the rest of the world. You have this group living in India, barely aware of this group living in Africa, this group living over here in China, and this group living over here in Europe. Each group in isolation. After 1500, all these groups of people start becoming aware of each other. As Europeans mainly began to branch abroad and explore Africa, explore the Far East, discover America. That happened in 1500, and also shortly after 1500, a big reform spread across Europe, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. The next chapter is entitled Reform and State Building. But a big reformation occurred, a reformation in religion, led by a man named Martin Luther. Oh, I'm tempted to ask for a show of hands of how many have even heard of Martin Luther. I'm not going, I didn't mean you to put your hand up. All right, you've heard. Good for you. I didn't mean you to put your hand up because it might be embarrassing to those of you, and then again, some of you might not be telling. But anyway, Martin Luther led the way. There was another reform. It was a reform in state building. Kings became stronger. The governments became more centralized, in addition to reform in theology. We're going to be talking about that next week, maybe even as early as Thursday, next class. Anyway, things began to happen that changed the world. What motivated Europeans to want to branch out and burst out from their continent and overspread the globe? This has been a subject of many, many books, subject of a lot of speculation. Some historians will say it was the Black Death that spread over Europe in the 1300s that made Europeans less afraid of death. Others say it was the influence of men like, and I want you to remember this man's name, Marco Polo in the 1300s traveled all the way to China, went to the court of the great Kublai Khan in China and became an ambassador of Kublai Khan to Japan, traveled to China and Japan, and then came back and wrote a book about what he had seen while he was in China. Christopher Columbus, again, no show of hands, but a bunch of you might not even have heard of him either. Christopher Columbus read Marco Polo's book, and it influenced him in his travels. But it made Europeans become aware that, hey, there is a bunch of worlds beyond our world that we need to go and explore and look at. In addition, there were some new inventions that were made. Inventions like a rudder. Now, I mean, hey, they had rudders, but the old-fashioned rudder in the old small boats was just a stick, an oar you stick down in the water and turn a boat with a hand. This type of rudder was a rudder that could be controlled by a steering wheel. It had actually been invented by the Chinese. The rudder, the compass, astrolabe, better sails were invented. The triangular sail of olden times was replaced by the square sail, and the square sail could be twisted and turned with more flexibility than a triangular sail, even to the point where that they could sail against the wind. Oh, the wind's blowing this way, you want to move this way? Some of you might know about sailboating to know how to do it. Partly you angle, but partly, you first go at a 45-degree angle to the wind, then another 45-degree angle, and partly you twist your sails in such a way that it catch the wind and propel your boat in the direction you want to go, which might not always be the way the wind's blowing. But Europeans made these kind of discoveries. Then, in addition, they made bigger and stronger ships, and their ships could carry heavier cannon. And a heavier cannon meant that they could defeat any other ship, particularly the ships that the Muslims put against them, because the European sailors could be firing on their enemies before the enemy could return fire, because their cannon would fire farther. And eventually, in fact, Europeans conquered the Indian Ocean, or took over the Indian Ocean. The compass, before the invention of the compass, European sailors would navigate by the sun and by your book calls it the pole star, the North Star. The big problem with that is, what if it's a cloudy night and the North Star is not visible? You're pretty well lost until the sun, until the clouds clear away. Same with the sun. What if it's a cloudy day and you can't really see the sun? Well, again, you're fairly well lost until the clouds clear away and you can see the sun again. But with a compass, it works all the time. Cloudy or clear, hot or cold, and the compass also worked. This is something the North Star would do. If you got too close to the equator and then got south of the equator, you can't see the North Star anymore. But if you use a compass, you can find your way. So they developed better navigational techniques. Astrolabe, that's a device you point toward the horizon. Again, the sun has to be out. If you can see the sun and the horizon, you can pretty well tell where you are in the globe. Something like an old-timey GPS system. Regrettably, I don't know a whole lot about the astrolabe, except it was an important navigational device that put European sailors ahead of the sailors of the rest of the world. These inventions have been made by the Chinese, and you have to wonder if the Chinese had invented them, how come they didn't use them to, well, I'm going to talk in more detail about that in about 3 chapters, about why the Chinese, having all these inventions, did not burst out and overspread the globe. Instead, it was the Europeans. Historians have debated this issue for generations now. All right. Anyway, and one thing that motivated Europeans was religion. They felt like they had a duty and obligation to spread Christianity around the globe. Your book, though, the authors take the standard modern view that more than religion, they were motivated by greed, a desire to find spices and gold and get wealthy. Each of you can decide for yourself what might have been the motivating factor that influenced Europeans to behave as they did. If you look on a map of Europe, what European country is the westernmost country in Europe? Anybody remember? Yes? Portugal. Portugal. Excellent. It's logical that the Portuguese would somewhat lead the way. Portugal led the way in the exploration of new worlds. The Portuguese were influenced by a prince named Henry the Navigator. I called him Prince. He was the 4th son of King John I of Portugal. He never got the throne. When King John I died, the throne went to his older brother. But he had the title Prince because his father was king. But Prince Henry the Navigator, a member of the royal family, was in charge of Portugal's seafaring, seagoing. And Henry particularly encouraged his sailors to sail around Africa. There were a couple of problems with this. They didn't know if the continent of Africa ever ended. I mean, it just seemed to go on and on and on. If they had read their history books more carefully, they would have known that a Persian king had sent a ship around Africa, and the Greeks had sailed around Africa more than 2,000 years before. In a case, about 1,800 years before. So the continent of Africa did have an end. But the Portuguese sailors would keep sailing, and each one of them sailed a little bit farther than one before him. And they began to set up outposts along the African shoreline. And eventually, a Portuguese sailor rounded the Cape of Good Hope, but he didn't make it all the way. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope and said, hey, the continent of Africa does seem to come to an end. I think I found the end. But he came back. His sailors refused to sail farther. But finally, Vasco da Gama, And this is where your book opens up the chapter talking about him. Vasco da Gama went around Africa and landed in India. And your book goes to the detailed account of how he was met by some friendly people in India, and they helped him unload his wares, and he bought a bunch of spices from them and carried these spices back to Portugal. And going around Africa was much, much cheaper than going overland, because between Europe and India lay the Muslim world, and the Muslim world would make sure the prices of Indian goods were really high by the time they got to Europe. Vasco da Gama went back a year or two later with a very large fleet and came back with loads of spices. And somewhat enriched the nation of Portugal. The people of India were not impressed with the Europeans at first. I mean, the European sailors had scurvy. They came in dirty, ragged ships, and they were dirty, ragged sailors. They were unaware